Onassis Foundation.
Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello, could I please speak with Abraham Verghese?
Speaking, Paul. How are you?
Abraham, what a pleasure to have you on this call. Thank you so much for making the time and for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. You asked me how I am. I am very happy to be speaking to you and extremely eager to hear how you have been spending these last 4 months of what we might call the quarantine times.
I know, that's a great question. I feel like I've been right in the middle of it. Just living and experiencing the evolving story at many levels, but especially at the level of my narrow world of the hospital where, we went from normal to suddenly realizing that this thing was upon us. It was in our county and having patients. And, I think as a storyteller, in addition to my day job, I couldn't help seeing that it had all the elements of story evolving. We had the conflict and the crisis. The only thing we don't have is the ending.
Right.
But it's been fascinating to see how a hospital goes from, its regular routine to suddenly having to create scenarios where we think about what happens if we lose 1/3 of our staff because of, attrition or quarantine. What happens if we lose half of them? And then to watch all our patient population basically stay away, and that's the lifeblood of the economy, or the engine of our little country, if you like, and all our attention focused on COVID. And, just to give you a sense of the scale, we use 20,000 masks every day on a normal day, pre-COVID. And so if you remember the early months of all the worry about how do we get enough personal protective equipment and gloves, gowns, masks, that was so all-encompassing for a while. And then, of course, the narrative has shifted now to, is there a surge? Is the surge coming? Have we passed the surge? And so it goes. It's just been a fascinating thing to see the evolving narrative, and also my great sense of fellowship with colleagues in far-flung places from Italy to Delhi to New York to Brooklyn, and, just feeling fortunate that we're not suffering as much as they are, but also feeling terribly, terribly guilty that we haven't been there to help them. And I guess the other thing that I find myself marveling at, which is a strange word to be using in these times, is the pace of science. The ingenuity of this virus and the pace of scientific discovery. I mean, to think about the fact that within a few weeks of this virus existing on Earth, we knew its entire genome. And a few weeks after that, we knew...
Really?
Yeah. And a few weeks after that, we knew exactly what part of the virus targeted what receptor on the human body. And, so as a scientist, I think it's much more refreshing for me to look at the scientific headlines than to look at the daily news, because, as I said, the virus is logical, science is doing its best, and then it's so divorced from the larger narrative around us, which you and I are living through, of how does a populace respond to this? And I must say, I think that our urge to locate ourselves in a story is very human. I mean, where were you when people landed on the moon? Where were you? We're always full of those questions where we're trying to place ourselves in time in an evolving narrative. And I think a lot of us, and perhaps the Quarantine Tapes fits that bill, we have this great need to tell the story almost as a means of surviving this plague, is to be able to locate it in the story that we can make sense of for ourselves. That's a long-winded answer.
No, but I'll unpack many of its elements. First of all, yes, The Quarantine Tapes is very much about that. It's a chronicle of our time. When we look back, it will tell a story. It will tell a story from so many different parts of the world, so many different disciplines, so many points of view. And when you use the word narrative and you use the word survive, it reminded me of the extraordinary, very short quotation of Umberto Eco, who said, to survive, you must tell stories. But I'm also immediately taken by this notion of narrative, which you've used maybe 5 or 6 times in the space of just a few minutes. And you wrote to me, and I think that's what's so interesting. On the one hand, you're an infectious disease doctor at Stanford, and on the other hand, you are a writer who tells stories very often from the point of view of someone who is a scientist and a doctor. And it made me think of what you wrote to me when you said that you're thinking of an overarching narrative that will tie all of this together. And that made me think, and I promise to stop after that, Abraham, that made me think of John Berger, who said that poetry can repair no loss, but it defies a space which separates by reassembling what has been scattered. So what are you assembling, as it were, now in your mind and maybe in fact on paper?
Well, I must say I love that quote because I think it's analogous to long ago Richard Selzer, a very distinguished physician writer, had a short story collection called Taking the World in for Repairs.
Oh, really?
And I think that story does that. We engage in stories to understand how the world lives. We use stories to educate our children, and I think it's just a very human instinct to sort of think in terms of stories. And what is medicine, Paul, but story plus, but life plus. Life at its most dramatic at times, even though a lot of the time it's fairly routine. But I think it's the practice of watching, the practice of, connecting the stories that you're seeing and living with the larger repertoire of stories that you have in your consciousness. And in that sense, to come back to your question, it strikes me how some of our frustration at the vagaries of human behavior, about the missteps in the way this is being handled by politicians and so on, none of these should really surprise us, because if you study narratives of the plague, and I wish our politicians had studied this, you would understand that all these things are really destined to be, unless we really have very educated humanists who rule countries, which, as you know, we don't. But I'm just marveling when I look at things like Camus' The Plague to see how many echoes and instructions even are there for how we might live. In fact, there's a lovely definition that Dorothy Allison has about fiction. She calls it the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives. And so, in Camus' wonderful fictional account of Oran, I think you have a great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives, about how ignorance can be such an evil force, and how the elements that we're seeing right now all reclaim themselves. But I'm also trying to connect this, Paul, to the larger societal narrative that has been very much connected to this, I think related to this, and that is the narrative of the George Floyd incident and all the emotions and the waking of the subconscious mind that has taken place in people who are not Black. I mean, that is just absolutely intriguing to me. I was born in Africa, very much, I'm aware of the whole stain, that we carry in America of the first slaves coming in 1619. And in many ways, as Mitch McConnell said, it is the original sin that we have not quite come to terms with, even though the succession of, constitutional amendments have given more freedom. And we have no more constitutional amendments. This is going to be something that requires something you can't legislate. It's an opening of the human heart. It's a true moment of understanding of the experience of the other. So I think they're all linked.
It's a reckoning.
It's a reckoning. And, at the very simplest level, it's a reckoning because this virus has disproportionately affected, people, minorities more than anyone else. I mean, we've always known that there are health equities. We've always known that, mortality rates are very much related to health inequities. But nowhere has this become more evident than in the way this virus has savaged the country. I mean, at the one level, it doesn't really think about who it's attacking, but at another level, it takes advantage of crowding. It takes advantage of lack of access to care. It takes advantage of, poverty. And I think it just managed to come at this moment when, it wound up being the catalyst for a kind of waking of the subconscious mind that I'm not sure we would have experienced otherwise in quite this fashion.
What you just said made me think that there are many viruses. There's more than one virus going around.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
And when you spoke about the stain, that is but another virus which we haven't dealt with at all.
Yeah, I think that's actually true of so many diseases. I mean, I think of my early experiences with HIV, where I cut my teeth. I remember as a young practitioner who was seeing HIV in a small town, and one of the few people seeing patients, willing to see patients, and they were coming from far and wide. I always thought that I was dealing with two diseases. There was the virus on the one hand, but then there was a second disease that traveled with the virus, and it was the metaphor of what it meant to have that virus. And the metaphor in those days was the metaphor of shame and secrecy. And, and many times I thought that the metaphor killed my patient before the virus had a chance. They took their lives, or they did self-destructive things because they could not live with what it meant to have the virus. And I've been racking my brain, and maybe you can help me as to what is the metaphor of this virus. I mean, plague is obvious, but, I think it's disorder, it's confusion, it's exposing, the very lack of connectedness of not just ourselves as a country, but a world, such that it could take such advantage of us.
And
disorder would be the word.
And what is so terrible is that in this moment, the last thing that medicine needed was more distance. You have spoken so beautifully, Abraham, about the tactile inebriation the doctor feels with his patient. The need to touch in the sense of a tactile relationship, in the sense of contact, in the sense of having tact, which in the Middle Ages was often seen as a virtue, as a cardinal virtue. And now we need all this distance, and this distance keeps us from an understanding and even a possibility of knowing the stories of our patients. Can you comment on this and on this idea of distance, not only social distancing of 6 feet, but the fact that many of the patients who die of this terrible disease die alone, not being able to say farewell to those closest to them?
Yeah, I know. It's been the most painful thing to observe. Even people without COVID. I had the misfortune of a dear friend who had a chronic illness and a flare-up that required her to be in hospital for about 6 weeks in the middle of all this. And her family could not visit, not because of anything related to her disease, but because of COVID. And, she finally said she had enough and she died at home. But, the highlight of her stay was really the moment she got home and was finally able to receive the love of her family and friends before she died. And then the heart-wrenching experience of a funeral that takes place virtually. I mean, it is really heartbreaking, but the flip side to that, and as you know, I'm a great advocate for the physical examination as being more than just a gathering of facts, more than just what the body is trying to tell us, but also this great moment of intimate connection. It's such a ritual with all the trappings of ritual, in a room whose furniture does not look like the furniture in your house or mine, and one participant wearing a white gown, the other one wearing a paper gown, and strange ritualistic tools being pulled out. And then finally one person gets undressed and allows the stranger to examine them. I mean, we're absolutely unable to do that in quite the same way with a patient with COVID. because we're so masked and gowned and anonymous. But there's been an interesting silver lining to this story. We, for example, were in the genesis of our telemedicine video visits before COVID hit. And they have ramped up literally 50-fold in the last couple of months. And sitting in on some of those calls, it's been really humbling to me, almost embarrassing, because for the first time, we're seeing patients in their houses. We're getting a much better sense of who they are when we don't make them these anonymous individuals who traipse to our clinic and have to find parking and have to sit in the waiting room. And we see their family wandering by. We get a sense of their resources and, all the lip service I and so many others paid to this whole notion of, the social determinants of health and the need to really understand the family and the setting. We had this opportunity many, many months ago, and we're only just beginning to understand that, in a sense, the patient is reminding us that this is where they live, and the burden is now on us more and more. I'm talking about the outpatient setting. Burden is on us now to take advantage of this moment. I mean, there's so many opportunities popping up to change medicine, but I think this will be one of the most interesting ways, not just televisits, but the notion that we can have a home clinic and we can visit the patient in the home, and there are legions of data points that we have no idea about because we're never there. We make them come to us.
It's so interesting because immediately what I see you saying is by going to a patient's home, you end up being a semiotician of some sort. You read the signs, you read where they are, you read their surroundings, you read what makes them comfortable. Another way, Abraham, of storytelling.
Absolutely. I mean, just to give you an example of that, my most powerful memory of home visits, and I try to do them when I can, but they're usually in crisis. They're usually at the end of life, And what I'm learning is that we shouldn't wait that long. But I remember going to see an HIV patient in his house because he could no longer come to the clinic. He was too weak to come to the clinic, and he was not acutely ill enough to be in the emergency room. So I took myself at the end of the day, because it didn't sit well with me that I might not see him again. I took myself over to his house, which is way out in the countryside in a trailer. And I remember, Paul, how powerful the effect of my coming was on him and the family in terms of coming to terms with the illness, even though I'd gone there just for my own purposes. And I suddenly realized, this is what the horse and buggy doctor of a couple of 100 years ago did so well. They could not cure, but they could heal by their presence, by their willingness to come to the home. They could cure the soul, if you like, even when they could not cure the disease. And I try to convey this a lot to my students ever since I had that insight that, I use an analogy of if you go to your home after the end of the day and find that your lock has been broken, your door is open, all your valuables are gone, you will be bereft, not just because you lost physically valuable stuff, but because someone violated your space. And then if the police come by an hour later and say, we found the person who did this, here is all your stuff back, you will be cured, but you will not be healed. Your sense of violation will linger. And I think that, a valuable lesson of this epidemic has been that, the science alone and the restoration of the physical is not quite enough. There's a huge moral, spiritual violation that's happening to all of us, from being confined to our houses, not being allowed to meet our loved ones, watching them die by themselves. It's the second part of this illness, the great isolation that it engenders.
You talk beautifully about the sacred text of the body, and you like this little anecdote, more than an anecdote, actually, something that Jackson Pollock wrote. He said, when I'm in my painting, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. It is only after a sort of get acquainted period that I see what I have been about. It is only when I lose contact with the painting that the result is lost, is a mess. Otherwise, there is pure harmony, an easy give and take, and a painting comes out well. And this to you, in a way, speaks directly to the challenges of practicing medicine today. I'm wondering why.
It's funny, that quote is not one I've heard before, but I identify with it almost immediately. Between you and me, as you know, I'm a immigrant to this country, and always having to prove myself, having studied medicine elsewhere. You're always a foreign graduate. You're always, when you first arrive, you're working in the inner city hospitals. You're working everywhere where American medical graduates don't want to work. And mind you, without this annual influx of foreign doctors, many of these places would simply collapse. And so you always have this, sense of conflicting identity, trying to prove yourself. And when I am at Stanford now, which I've been for almost a decade, believe it or not, I walk around thinking, this is paradise. Any moment, someone's going to tap me on the shoulder and say, "Where aren't you? You're out of here."
You too. I think many of us walk around with that strange feeling that we might be found out.
But the only moment that I don't feel that way is when I'm on the wards, and people who know me well are always commenting on that. I mean, as busy as it might get, as hectic as it gets, I'm going to be on the wards starting the July 4th weekend again for another week. It's somehow all of my insecurities fade away in this wonderful ministry. I mean, this is not to say it's always rewarding and easy, and we have our share of very, very difficult patients and families and so on, but nevertheless, the enterprise of caring for the other, doing your best even when they're not necessarily appreciative or, are actually combative. The enterprise, to me, is very restoring, and I feel incredibly blessed to not just be a part of it, but to actually get to sit back like this with you and think about it and, ask myself, how does this story end? What is the narrative going to tell us?
You may not have known that Jackson Pollock quote, but I know that this one matters to you greatly, coming from Somerset Maugham on Human Bondage, where it goes like this: Philip saw humanity there in the rough, the artist canvas, and he said to himself, "This is something I can be good at," which spoke to you, I think, profoundly, because that in a sense was a vocation you chose for yourself.
Yeah, thank you for doing that research, because I love that passage so much, and I'm sure I've talked about it and written about it. I think it was a moment in time when I have brothers who are sheer geniuses, math whizzes, and I had no head for math or any particular aptitude in school. And yet, but I was a reader. I was a voracious reader. But when I came to that passage in Of Human Bondage, where Philip is in Paris wrestling to be an artist, and he has this terrible moment of truth where he realizes that he doesn't quite have the talent, and he retreats with his tail between his legs to go back to London, where there's a small annuity if he chooses to study a profession. And then he finally, after all the years of drudgery, the first 2 years of anatomy, whatnot, he finally arrives on the wards, and he has this epiphany. Philip saw humanity there in the rough, the artist's canvas, and he said to himself, "This is something I can do. This is something I can be good at." And it was a moment of epiphany for me. I felt like the author was saying, and he's a physician himself, that you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be anything, except you have to be willing to work very hard, and you have to care deeply and empathize with your fellow human being, and then you can enter this covenant. And to the degree that you bring comfort to others, it will also comfort you. Because I think all of us in medicine, the major motivation for us to go to medicine is to take care of our own woundedness. There's a woundedness that is easily satisfied by ministering to others, and it's been about the career which I just feel incredibly blessed to have been part of.
How do you impart that to students now? Because I imagine, so much of their life is done with speed. They have to move quickly. The whole notion of, I think maybe you and I have spoken about that on other occasions, but this whole notion of slow reading, of reading the body slowly, of taking time when you see a patient to hear their story. The story you hear and the story they tell is so important, but there's so many other factors, economical factors. You have to move quickly. How do you manage, also as a professor, not just as a doctor on the ward, but someone who teaches students to become more human, in a sense?
Well, I think my own bias is that, paradoxically, students come to us with a wonderful capacity to imagine the suffering of others. And they really don't need much instruction, but a very strange thing happens to them when they go from their second to their third year of medicine, when they go from the preclinical stuff to being on the wards, what I tend to call from their pre-cynical to cynical. What happens is that they just get inundated with how much information that they have to swallow, and they become very disease-oriented. And, it's our doing, basically. It's our fault. And patients wind up becoming, the heart attack in bed 3 and the pneumonia in bed 4. And the good news is that most students come back to some version of themselves, typically before residency, during residency, after residency. But I think what you can do as an attending on the ward is, and I find this much more useful on the wards than in the classroom, is when you're rounding, to look for those moments of connection, to look for those opportunities to sort of connect the human experience beyond the disease that is in front of us. And it's all around us, and actually students sometimes need permission to be allowed to emote like that. I always say, if I see a student crying on the ward, I know I've just met someone who has the makings of a great physician, because you have to care about this to do it well. You could be technically very skilled, but to do it really well, if you don't really care, if it's just a job, at some point it will actually defeat you before it defeats a patient. Because, without the joy in what you're doing, without that sense of calling and empathy, without feeling, I don't think you can really enjoy what is a very rigorous and dangerous profession right now, quite frankly.
Sadly, in closing, Abraham, you were talking, in a sense, you were talking about the elegance of science at the very beginning of our conversation, and how in some way that inspires you with what I take to be a certain optimism. Do you believe that this moment, both of the social unrest and the unrest that has come through the pandemic, is a portal, might open a space for something new to come in and for change to happen?
I hope so. But I think that the lesson of Camus and so many others is that, don't hold your breath. I think we'll be a little bit better prepared, but, plague always takes us by surprise, as Camus says. No matter how many times we experience it, war and plague always comes as a surprise, although there's always been war and plague. I think what might happen, what I'd like to see happen, is that the triumph of science will allow people who are so science skeptic to become more appreciative. I would like to think that politicians from the very top will begin to be more savvy, that they need to understand story, they need to understand previous plague narratives in order to understand life and to govern properly. And I hope that all of us, will just sort of become better human beings, less unconscious about the fact that we are mortal, that life ends, and therefore better able to reach out to others and to, share the wealth of our whatever we have to share. So I'm an eternal optimist, and I think that the end of this narrative, which I just started with, is that ultimately this will all come together, painfully so, but in a way that shapes this world to be in a better place, in a better direction.
You've mentioned Camus so many times that I have to read this quotation to you and have you comment on it as we say goodbye. In The Plague, which now has been sold tens of thousands of times around the world, which is itself an interesting phenomenon, Camus writes the following: "The evil in the world comes almost always from ignorance, and goodwill can cause as much damage as ill will if it is not enlightened. People are more often good than bad, though in fact that is not the question."
What a beautiful quote. I have one of his quotes on my wall right in front of me.
Tell me.
And it's Camus, and it says, "I have no idea what awaits me, but as long as there are sick people in the world and they need curing, I will be there." And I think that could just as well be a Hippocratic oath, because I think it's powerful. Sometimes you just have to take another step and take another step and keep going.
Abraham, what a distinct pleasure it has been to speak with you. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I can't wait to see you in person. But for now, I send you a virtual hug. And thank you very,
my
very
friend.
much. Thank you very much. Take good care. Stay safe.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.